everyone's sexuality has a footprint. And there are multiple factors that are going to influence how somebody expresses their sexual concerns, expresses their sexuality all together. And so I tell them it does matter about like their pregnancy postpartum. It does matter their meds. All of those things matter. But what also matters is the state they're living in, their gender identity, politics, like all of those things matter, and they kind of find their way into a person's bedroom.
I'm Cindy Darnell. Welcome to The Erotic Philosopher, the podcast where we examine and explore sex and relationships through social, personal, cultural, scientific, political, and other lenses, and unpack and explore your erotic quandaries with the world's wisest erotic philosophers. Today on The Erotic Philosopher, I have an absolute treat for you. Dr. Uchenna Ossai. We call her UC. She's a physical therapist, a DPT, a WCS, and a CLT, and she's the creator and founder of UC Logic, a judgment-free social media platform dedicated to the sex education and empowerment of adults and grown folk. Dr. Ossai spends her days as an assistant professor in the Department of Women's Health at the University of Texas Dell Medical School, as well as the manager of the Pelvic Health Physical Therapy program at UT Health Austin. Dr. Ossai is also an ASEC certified sexuality counselor and also serves as faculty at the University of Michigan School of Social Work for Sexual Health Certification Program. Her clinical research interests include sexual dysfunction in marginalized populations, particularly Black and brown women and non-binary vulva owners, and people in the LGBTIAQ+ communities. Enjoy this fantastic conversation with UC. UC, welcome to The Erotic Philosopher.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
I am so excited too. And I've been following you on social media for some time, and you make these gorgeous videos, your bourbon tales, and then your kind of dancing videos, answering people's sex questions. And I thought, who better to have on The Erotic Philosopher than your fabulous self? And also, let me say, you are the first physical therapist I have interviewed on the show, because everybody else have been sex therapists, lots of therapists, because we all hang out together, therapists, counselors, educators. I think I haven't had any doctors yet, but you're the first physical therapist. So welcome, doubly welcome.
Thank you. I actually feel quite honored to be the first PT on your podcast, because it's so funny. When I became a physical therapist strictly to treat people with pelvic health dysfunction or pelvic floor issues, like that's why I wanted to be a PT. I wasn't interested. I wasn't interested in sports. I wanted to just do the pelvic stuff. And I just stumbled upon the sexual health piece of it at the beginning of my career. And, that's where I am today.
So that is really amazing, because I think I know that there are, a lot of pelvic floor therapists around, but not that many actually. And so, before we get into your journey into the world of physical therapy and sex and pleasure, for people who may be meeting you for the first time, what would you like them to know about you?
Wow, that's such a great question. For people who are meeting me for the first time, everyone talks about their profession first and then kind of themselves second. And I want people to know that I have always been, a Black woman, an anti-racist human who believes in everyone's full humanity, everyone on this planet. And that actually is what guides me in life. And it's what guides me as a healthcare provider. It's what guides me as a professor and an educator, and it guides me as a sex counselor.
It's so important to be able to look at how all of these intersections inform our capacity to live, just to be a citizen in the world, our capacity to be a healthcare practitioner in whichever field is our jam. And then also, then how that sits with our personal sort of identity and our politics. And I think increasingly we are no longer able to just sit back and say, well, I'm just a therapist, or I'm just a PT, or I'm just a doctor, or I'm just a whatever. We are all, I think, perhaps for the first time in history, and correct me if I'm wrong, that sense of rising up and going, you know what? The system doesn't work. It doesn't really serve most of us. We need to change this from the ground up, and we need to look at it through the lens of sex, race, gender, orientation, pleasure, accessibility, joy, physicality, the whole, banana. So let's start, you see, from this place where you say, I'm a Black woman, I'm a PT, I'm a professor, I work with students, and I'm a sex counselor. How do these pieces inform and embolden your experience of being in the world?
That's a deep question, Cindy. You're starting
this
out
is why
like
it's the erotic philosopher.
We
go right in there. Yeah. This is not sex ed 101, baby. We're going in at 301.
Yeah. So, I think we're all grown, right? We're all grown folk. We go through different phases in our life, and different experiences inform how we step through life. And I think my identity as a Black woman gives me this unique lens, right? I see things from my experience, and not just pain, not just trauma, but joy, right? Freedom, love. I do want to kind of put that piece on it, because I think there's been so many conversations of the pain and the struggle and the discrimination and the bias, which we all have. But there's also a side of joy and freedom in being a Black woman. I'm very proud of that. But it was work for me to do that, because I grew up in mostly white spaces, upper middle class white spaces, and in Dallas, Texas. And kind of it was when I left home for college. I went to school in Boston, and grad school and residency and all of the things that I kind of had to start to understand my place in the world. And I think that particularly when I started working with patients, and I started to see, okay, the Black experience is not uniform. The Black experience is different for each individual, because I was starting to understand, okay, there's social determinants of health, right? Education, socioeconomic status, right? All of those factors. And then there are social determinants of equity, right? And those are the isms, right? That's the sexism, the racism, all that. And it gets internalized, and we deal with it from an interpersonal level, and we deal with it from a systemic level. And the more I started to understand how the systems informed how we interact with one another, and then most importantly, how we interact with ourselves, it actually opened up this opportunity to be better human, and then to be a better provider, and to be a better educator, because then I understood it at a deeper level than a lot of my colleagues did. And it's not because I'm smarter or better than them. It's because I was put in a situation where I was almost not necessarily forced, but kind of, encouraged to look deeper. And then my individual curiosity said, I need to understand this. I'm getting a whole doctorate, but they're not really explaining to us why there are these health disparities. Because oftentimes when I lecture, I say, I started grad school, I started PT school thinking that it was all about yoga and eating right and managing my stress and not having like grape drink all the time and fried chicken, and then I'll close the gap. And then when I started reading about, Black women with terminal degrees have worse health outcomes than white women with high school diplomas.
Wow.
What the hell?
So that's a big thing. Yeah, right.
Right. And you see it across the board, across particularly among Black women and Indigenous women, right? And so I'm just like, what the hell? What is that? And I was like, and you look at when they control for, wealth, when they control for, access to insurance, education attainment, still you have this profound disparities. I'm like, well, these women did everything society told them to do. They went to college and grad school. They make a lot of money. They're contributing to society in a positive way. Why are they sicker? Oh, because of racism. Because of the stress of racism, right? Because the higher they climb, there's fewer of them up there, right?
That's a really important point.
It's a really important point. And so they're kind of working in spaces at higher levels, navigating the same thing that their white male colleagues are navigating with, but their white male colleagues aren't dealing with racism. They're not dealing with sexism. They're not dealing with that at that visceral level. And the tax and the internal cost of tempering yourself and playing those respectability politics and making, all of that takes a toll internally. And that also feeds into why we're seeing such horrible death rates when it comes to maternity and infant death among Black women. You have that impact of racism on health, but then you also have the impact of racism on health from an interpersonal standpoint. So now we're going back out to the thing that people know, the bias that their provider has, right? The knee-jerk internalized biases that their provider has. And if it doesn't get examined, it's not going to be addressed. And so people, if they automatically think I'm in a helping profession, therefore I cannot be problematic and I'm not contributing to the problem, that's absolute nonsense. Just like consent, you need to look at your bias on a continuous and ongoing basis. You have to kind of recheck yourself and look at these processes. And it's not going to be comfortable, but it's so worth it. Because when you come on the other side of it, gosh, there's so much freedom.
And that is such a powerful statement right there, that on the other side of the discomfort of digging into how the systems don't serve everybody, if we are willing to get uncomfortable, I often talk about it as being like a tight pair of shoes, that when you're wearing them in the beginning, it hurts. And it's like, really, if I just could take these off, everything would be that much better. But you can't, and you have to wear them. And the more that you walk in them, the looser and the softer they get. And then you're able to really enjoy, be with the experience and learn more about, well, what happens on the other side when I can see, we don't know what we don't know, and we must be willing to go through some degree of discomfort in order to grow, to become a better person. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of growth in ease. And this is part of it for all of us, that certainly as an Australian white person now living in the United States and working in the United States, I've sort of had a very rapid schooling into how the disparities work in this country. And, in my country, there are disparities also. They show up differently. The systems are different. Certainly the medical system is profoundly different. And, we don't need to talk about that. But, racism is racism. Same shit, different shovel, as we would say in Australia. Has the same impact, but manifests somewhat differently in different cultural contexts. So for me, learning about it here and being here, and for me, I live in Harlem, so I'm often surrounded by people of color. I'm definitely the minority in my Australianness, certainly, but that's fine. But and also my whiteness here, And that's been an extraordinary learning curve for me too. Also, because given the work that I do, navigating that and sort of understanding that if I tell people that I'm a sex therapist, particularly people in this neighborhood who are maybe quite religious, quite churchy, quite, who are, maybe not comfortable with that. And I'm learning, how do I navigate that and still remain in my truth around the work that I do, but also be respectful of the culture that I'm navigating and not come charging in like, you need to be like me. So that's really been a learning curve for me too. And I'm definitely all ears when it comes to people who are willing to talk about how we can make it better. And I also understand that we are all learning. I don't necessarily think anybody has all the answers, it's a work in progress. But if we don't talk about it, then nothing's going to change.
Absolutely. And I think, what's so funny when we're talking about the context of racism, the isms, as I like to call it, when we're in our training, right? When you were training to be a therapist, when I was training to be a therapist, they didn't really talk about it from a clinical, like a deep-rooted clinical. They didn't help us connect the dots. They didn't help us examine how our biases and the biases. I think people just need to get comfortable talking about that, first of all, because I think people think it's some moral stain that they have a bias. And I'm like, but what? That's how society was built. Society was literally built on the concept of white supremacy. We all have internalized that. It's all hardwired in every single human on this planet. So it makes sense that we have that. Why not understand it more? Why not dismantle it more? But they didn't connect the dots for us. And so, as I'm sure you had to, and I had to get extra training on the sexual health component. I had to continue to kind of fight to get that foundational knowledge. And then I'm still kind of working on connecting, okay, how now do we look at the impact of racism, the impact of homophobia, the impact of ableism on the sexual scripts that a person creates in their mind? And then how does that impact their sexual decision-making, their communication, right? Their audacity, their autonomy? All of that matters. And if we kind of sit in this vacuum where we're saying, well, that's a separate conversation and I don't want to get into politics, I'm like, no, don't even think of it as politics. This is just the reality of people's lives, right? If you're measuring their depression symptoms, if you're measuring their anxiety symptoms, then you need to measure the impact of discrimination.
Yeah. And we cannot talk about well-being without being able to talk about it in the context in which it exists. And, with my initial therapeutic training, it was very much just about, the traditional model of the emphasis on the individual and the history and the blah and all that stuff. And then I did a subsequent degree in narrative therapy, which is all about the social context and social constructionism and, bringing all of the Foucault kind of stuff into it. And that really helped me solidify my position as a therapist, and then in particular working with sex and relationships, being able to see how they function as tiny microcosms of a much larger social structure. And so then, when we're looking at people who have bodies, bodies of culture, bodies of different historical inheritance that have nothing to do with anything that they have or haven't done by conscious choice. It's just how their bodies are, and then how they exist in relation to their partners, in relation to themselves, in relation to the world, and then how that informs right down to the micro level what happens in people's beds. And how people feel inclined to play out, their fantasies, how people feel inclined to play out their longings for emotional connection. What do you see in your work around how, and I do want to keep this with a definite focus on well-being, because I know that we do hear a lot of stories about the struggles of Black folks, and I want to hear about Black joy. I want to hear about Black women being extraordinary and being orgasmic and satisfied. How do you see that playing out in your professional life, in your personal life, if you want to talk about that? And, for people listening of any race and any gender, who often perhaps feel a bit marginalized in some fashion, how do we bring this around to be a much more inviting place to be? Where do we go to find that willingness and that capacity to take risks in our lives, to bring joy and pleasure to us?
Yeah, I think it actually, so, I have to say, like, I'm going to kind of combine personal and professional and evidence and things like that, what research says. But I think that the first thing starts with like kind of looking at one's own value, what is going to be protective and what's going to kind of help to support your joy and to support your pain and to support all of everything in between. I think that's an important piece is to kind of start with oneself. That's what we think, that's what we talk about when we're talking about sexuality, right? Is we have to kind of say, okay, what is it that's beautiful about sex? What's scary about sex? What do you perceive to be shame? Like you almost have to do that personal inventory and then say to yourself, okay, what is it that I'm going to surround myself with? What is it that I can easily control and manage? Is it the people that I communicate with? Is it the people that I'm sleeping with? Is it, how, because you need that pod that is literally existing to gas you up, to support you, to be your mattress to land on, and I say starting with that, no matter who you are, but particularly for BIPOC women, that's going to be essential. Because the more that you have that there, the more that you can thrive in that, like in that protected space. And when you thrive in that protective space, it builds your confidence. Because don't get it twisted. Racism, no one wins. No one wins. But particularly for people of color, it undermines self-esteem. It undermines confidence. Like it kind of gets in and it's like not fun racist glitter, right? And very hard to kind of navigate that. And so that's really, really important. And then, when you're thinking of the grand scheme of things, because another one of my subspecialties is looking at organizational leadership and like how to make workspaces safer and better for people, is thinking about, okay, there are things about your workplace, depending on how you work, that you can or cannot control, right? If you're working for a larger institution, you can't always necessarily fight City Hall immediately, unless that's in you and you're like, okay, I want to do that fight by all means, right? But for the most part, people are just wanting to kind of navigate the space in some level of safety. And I think accepting that, because there's this question I get where, how can I be my true self or how can I be my full self? And I'm like, sometimes you can at work. Sometimes that's just not an option at work, and that's okay.
Which is part of self-care, to scale back and go, is this the right environment for me to go full pedal to the floor, or should I pull back just to keep myself safe, to keep myself sane?
Exactly. And because I'm not going to tell someone leave, because not everyone has the choice to leave. Not everyone has the ability. Some people can, but for a lot of times people cannot. They got bills, they got kids, they got insurance, so I get that. So it's a matter of saying, okay, what's going to protect me now? Do I want to choose this battle here, or am I going to back up? Am I going to document? Am I going to record? Yeah, that's annoying, but I do that all the time at work. I have no problems to say that publicly. Like I record everything. I have receipts. I don't care, because I'm not going to be stuck in a situation that's going to cause me more harm by just simply existing as a Black woman. My existence is not a problem. And that's something that took me, years after, particularly, after high school, where I was like, one of 3 Black kids in my school, right? Or one of 4. That was tough. And it really kind of disrupted my value of myself. And understanding that too, like when you think about that from a sexual development standpoint, that does kind of have some impact, because you have the archetypes of Black women that are the mammy, the Jezebel, the angry Black woman, the superwoman. It's like, which archetype do you want to be? And which one do you want to avoid? And that can really, you could really struggle with that. And then of course too, particularly if you're dating, right? It's a matter of, then you think about the concept of colorism, it's like lighter skin, darker skin, big, full size bodies, smaller bodies, like all of that plays into it, right? Because look at all these stereotypes, sexual stereotypes we have. We have the fiery Latina, the submissive Asian, the wild Black woman, the large endowed Black man, like what? And even though it sounds ridiculous as I say it, we all internalize that. And so it took me some time to kind of to work through that for myself. And oftentimes when people are talking to me and they're saying certain things, and I'm like, so what is that about? Is that because you want to run away from that angry Black woman stereotype? Is it that you want to not be associated with the Jezebel stereotype that was rooted in systemic policies to oppress people, but now has become this longstanding stereotype that permeates all parts of our lives? I think that's giving people those tools and those nuggets, I think, can be really helpful. And it really helped me to look at that space and to kind of say, yeah, like, I'm going to record this conversation. I mean, you can ask me why, I'll tell you, but I don't think you want to hear it because you're not ready to, you don't want to do the work. I'm not trying to get you to do the work, but because you don't do the work, this is what I'm going to do for myself. And that's fine with me, until I decide that I don't want to be in that environment.
Yeah. And so with your interest in sexuality, and so you started out as a physical therapist, and then or did the physical therapy and the interest in sex kind of rise up at the same time, or which one came first? Which chicken, which egg appeared first?
Yeah, so the physical therapy started, and I'm a practicing physical therapist, and so what's funny was that when I was in my residency, I started getting more patients asking me specific questions about sex and sexuality, and I knew enough to answer their questions on a very basic level, but then I started to realize, if I'm treating people who have pain with intercourse, if I'm treating men with painful ejaculation, men and penis owners, where are the didactics to manage this? And so there wasn't anything specific. So I had to take a few extended courses, and then I did a certification program to give me that skill set. So I infused that into my physical therapy practice, because I think that all providers of care, body workers, mental health providers, doctors, nurses, PTs, PAs, chiropractors, we all need to have at least a foundational, if not almost like a level 1, level 2 understanding of sexual health, because it is an indicator of health. It does matter in a patient's, even if they have knee pain, right? It's definitely legitimate. And so that's kind of how my journey evolved. So it took about, when I graduated my residency program, it took me about 5 years to kind of complete that journey,
to get that whole circle. And so now, when you're in your teaching role, as aside from your practitioner role, how do you bring that knowledge to your students? How do you teach them, the UC philosophy of physical therapy and sex positivity? How does that work for you as a teacher?
Yeah, so I'm assistant professor at Dell Medical School. So it's funny. My students are med students and residents and fellows, and I'm like the only PT on faculty in this med school. So it's really
interesting. Yeah.
It's really interesting. And so the UC philosophy on things is that I teach them that everyone's sexuality has a footprint, and there are multiple factors that are going to influence how somebody expresses their sexual concerns, expresses their sexuality all together. And so I tell them it does matter about like their pregnancy, postpartum. It does matter their meds. All of those things matter. But what also matters is the state they're living in, their gender identity, politics, like all of those things matter. And they kind of find their way into a person's bedroom, and getting the students to understand that. And then also getting the students to understand their own sexual beliefs and how their sexual beliefs influence how they ask the questions on sexual health.
That is so important.
It's really important, because I think we spend a lot of time, especially in the health educator space, telling them, ask this question, this question, this question. But they need to get comfortable enough. They need to be comfortable enough, or at least start having those thought processes and saying that your beliefs are going to spill into how you ask these questions, just like your surgical decision-making is going to spill in, right? All those things, that's part of clinical decision-making. You need to know your sexual bias, right? You need to know what those biases are. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them. You just need to be aware of them. They need to be ever present. Because if you're a person that really has a lot of sexual shame, there's nothing there. Sexual shame sucks, but it's not that I'm saying
it's prevalent.
It's very prevalent. And I'm not telling that student, no, you can't practice medicine. No. But it's saying, okay, you yourself have a lot of sexual shame. So this is going to be a little bit more of a lift for you to ask these questions than it is for this other person who doesn't have the same level of sexual shame.
Yeah. And that as practitioners, we have to, coming back to that thing about the discomfort, we have to get comfortable being uncomfortable in a bunch of areas, and including this sex piece. And it's interesting, I know in Australia, most doctors, I think in their entire training, get about 12 hours of sex education, if that. And it's very much focused on function and reproduction. And so often, the first place that people go if they are experiencing a sex problem is they don't think about going to a physical therapist. They don't think about coming to a sex therapist or a sexologist or a sex whatever. They will most likely maybe go to a pharmacy first and get something over the counter because they don't want to talk about it. And then if it continues, the second thing they'll do is then go to a doctor who doesn't know anything about sex 95% of the time.
Exactly. And that is why it's so important to get them taught quickly, right? Get them in while they're young, right? When they're young and they're training, right? Like, I'm like, I need to kind of insert my little nuggets because I only get, a certain amount of time with y'all.
Come on, kids, let me insert my nuggets into you.
Right? Exactly. Let me, come on, chickens. Let's go. Come on, follow me. At least for a little bit, I
find that folks, because I can imagine you as a teacher would just be absolutely delightful and warm and fabulous. I wish you were one of my teachers when I was at college. Are they open and receptive? Are they willing to stretch themselves and do the work these days?
Oh yeah, I think that there, of course, there have been times where there's some resistance, saying, I had a conversation about porn one time in terms of the concept of porn, and that it's a very personal thing, and it really is aligned with people and their values and how they look at it. And I said, at the end of the day, what we do know to be a fact is that porn is not education. Porn is a form of sexual entertainment. And then from there, that's a whole other discussion, because then you can talk about the politics of porn, the ethics of porn, the morality, all of that. And I think, sometimes people think that I'm pro porn or an anti-porn. And I'm like, I'm not anything. I'm just telling you how this works, right? Because oftentimes, one time, there was a situation where there was a student with more conservative beliefs who had some concerns and questions, but it wasn't done in this difficult way where there was a lot of friction. It was more a perfect time to have this discussion out in the open with everyone, and saying that the discussion of sex is not me telling you to be extra sexual or whatever that means. I don't even know what that means.
Yeah. Go out and have sex with loads of people and, do stuff that you don't want to do just to show off that you're, sex positive. I think that perhaps was a message that somehow got twisted up with sex positivity, over the last decade or so. And now we're kind of unraveling all of that and going, no, that's not necessarily the path through either. So, one of the things that, aside from, people's kind of pains, physiological and emotional pains with sex that need to be addressed, on the flip side, there is this piece about the pleasure. There is this piece about, successful sex. And when sex is good, which of course is so subjective because what's good to one person is terrible to another person. How do we navigate the world of, good sex, successful sex, while also being attentive to the fact that the person we're jumping into bed with may have a different idea about good/successful sex?
Yeah. So, It's funny. A lot of times I get people who are already from the physical therapy end of things. I get people in relationships or solo, and they have a history of sexual issues. And all of that, it's funny how when I bring up this conversation of what is a successful sexual encounter, people look at me like I have 15 heads.
I so know that look.
They're like, what do you mean a successful sexual encounter? And I'm like, look, I don't know. You tell me. You came to me. I didn't do this. Like, like I'm here. So you came to moi, to me. And so I need you to tell me what is, what's good for you. And there's no wrong answer here. I just need to know where we're working from, because I have to establish goals. I need to help you achieve your goals. And so what's interesting is that when I ask them that, they say, gosh, I need to talk to my partner. And I said, cool, that's great. But is your partner's answer have to match yours? Can we just start with you? Because I think that, again, it's back to my original answer when we were talking about being Black and navigating spaces. It's about going back to what is important to you, knowing yourself, knowing what are your values. And you may not know what a successful sexual encounter is. Because oftentimes particularly in using the example of, cisgender heterosexual women, they come in and they say, I'm having pain with penetrative sex, with my husband or with my boyfriend or with my, partner or whatever. And I said, okay, well, what's successful? And they're like, well, pain-free sex. And I said, okay, great. So that's one scenario. That's one successful scenario. What's another successful scenario? And they're like, and I say, if that's the only marker of a successful sexual encounter, oh my, right? Because then we're just centering the penetration. And you just told me that you actually have great orgasms by yourself without penetration. And you know what I'm saying? And I'm like, can we add in your stuff to this, to a successful sexual encounter?
And so that's where it's become such a psychological and emotional flip to shift the whole narrative away from just successful sex is when it doesn't hurt me. Well, yeah. Of course, that helps, unless, of course, you want to be hurt, but that's a different conversation. And successful sex is not only when it doesn't hurt me, but also we need to start teaching, as you say, especially heterosexual cis women, how to talk about what feels good. And sometimes it is about decentering intercourse. Sometimes, in fact, I would say oftentimes it is about decentering intercourse. And often it's about decentering the penis. And that sends a lot of heterosexual cis women into a tailspin, because they have never thought about sex that doesn't involve a penis. But when they masturbate, they very rarely, if ever, will do insertion, because generally when women masturbate, it's always clitoral stimulation. They don't, sometimes they use dildos and things, but often it's all on the outside. But it's almost like the presence of a penis makes the implication is that, well, the penis must be tended to no matter what, even if you don't feel like it.
Right. And I think also too, when we're thinking about, what do you do when your partner has a different idea of a successful sexual encounter? I said, that's also great, right? Because sex fundamentally, whether you're with one partner, multiple partners, is a collaboration between two people. And so learning about what they define as a successful sexual encounter, and then you sharing with them your stuff, then you can kind of create a sexy, fun place or sexy, fun palace that everyone's needs, and not everyone's needs are going to be met fully, and not everyone's wants are going to be met fully, but gosh, you're going to sure try. You're going to talk about it. You're going to work together. You're going to communicate. That's the ebb and flow. But I think what's so funny is that it's a lot easier, especially for some of my patients, to really just focus on the penetration, because that to them is more like objective, more, this is something, I'm going to use my dilators. I'm going to put this in and I'm going to stretch here and stretch there. I'm going to do my breathing, because it doesn't require them to do that like deeper sexual work, that psychological work, and like dismantling it from a biopsychosocial framework and saying, oh my.
So you see, I think, what you're talking about, about the whole biopsychosocial piece is so important. And the fact that you're teaching in a medical college and you are teaching the next generation of practitioners to be attentive to, and then obviously you're teaching your patients as well, to be attentive to successful sex is not just about, getting pregnant or getting an erection or having an orgasm or, fitting a penis in your vagina, that it is so much more about how you feel about the experience. And one of the things that I talk about with my clients a lot is that, any sexual activity that we do, whether it's just with ourselves or with, 5 other people at the same time, so much of this is emotionally informed, where we are operating from a place of we want to feel something. I don't think there's anybody on the planet who engages in sex who is not motivated by some kind of sense of emotional validation, satisfaction, just something, even if they're by themselves and they're tired and they're just on their phone, 5 minutes before they go to sleep and they're just masturbating to a little bit of porn. Even that is an emotionally inspired action, because, if they're a bit stressed at the end of the day, you might come home and, have a bourbon, have a cigar and jerk off and fall asleep. All of that is about soothing the nervous system, soothing our emotions. And when we forget that and we think that sex is only about this functionality, like, just moving your body in such a way so you can get from A to B, that kind of stuff, when we take the emotionality out of sex, it flattens it. It takes it from a sort of multi-dimensional experience to this 2-dimensional experience that is absent of any meaning, absent of any color. And I think when people start really experiencing problems with sex, it's because their sex lives have flattened out in some way, that there's no texture, there's no meaning, there's no purpose, there's no reverence, there's no joy in it. And if we've never been taught that joy is something we are entitled to, it makes sex a very dark and lonely place, because it is confronting if you don't have a compass orienting you towards joy.
It very much so. I mean, you said that so beautifully. And, I think that like a lot of my patients struggle with that, because I think what's interesting is when I interview them with their first evaluation, and I say, okay, when did all this begin? 10 years ago, 6 years ago, 25 years ago. and then, and they say, is that bad? And I said, no, like, you're here. It's just that when you talk about the nervous system and how this nervous system is very intelligent, and it very much goes in the path that you it's on, right? And that's maintained. And so I almost tell them that the longer that you have this issue, the more your nervous system kind of digs its heels in. And we have to do some work to kind of retrain your nervous system. And that takes time, right? That takes time. And so getting into that kind of good enough sex model, like pain acceptance model, all of that, and allowing space for joy to come in and saying, there's so many things that bring you joy in the sexual space. What if we focus on those things that aren't penetrative or are penetrative, depending on what the issue is, right? Because I have people who don't have pain with sex at all, but they have pain with arousal, right? They have pain after sex, right? And so there are lots of things that we can kind of work on and then navigate in those spaces. And I think what's also fascinating too, Cindy, is when people get to a place of acceptance with themselves and then they realize their partner is still 20 steps behind. That's when it gets a little tricky.
It can get very tricky. I agree. And that's the thing that again, where our sex education becomes so important. And I don't just mean sex education in school, like where the babies come from, but like this kind of this is when I think about sex education. This is what I think about, is how do you talk to partners when your ideas of sex are different? How do you explain and explore places where you can meet each other and tolerate each other's discomforts and differences and desires without shutting everything down? And the models, I think, of sex and relationships that we've been spoon-fed through, either through Disney and things like that, or porn. And I think they really are two sides of the same coin. And often people get a bit like clutching their pearls when I compare porn to Disney. But I'm like, it's kind of how things roll in Western society. That, if we're not, being Disney princesses and we're not being porn stars, then where do we go? And there are very few, if any, models for that. And so then when people in their 20s, 30s, 40s come up against that and think, how is it that I've been, married or whatever for 10, 15 years and I don't know how to do this? There must be something wrong with me. I must be broken. And without the capacity to reflect and think, hang on, I actually don't know anybody who is having a successful, let's use that phrase, successful sex life. Or if they are talking about a successful sex life, they're talking about, we do it 5 times a week. But we don't really talk about the quality. We measure it in the terms of frequency. Like if we're doing it 5 times a week, that must be good. Are you enjoying yourself? Are you both enjoying yourself? And that is a conversation that almost never happens because we don't want to be uncomfortable in case our idea of success is different.
I agree. I think that, when people start having those conversations of, one person might define success as I feel affirmed in who I am in my body. I feel safe. I feel, connected with you. And the other person's like, well, successful sexual encounter is a blowjob. And you're just like, okay. And so one of my tips for people when they have this kind of different styles, right? Different education levels when it comes to that, is I always say to go back to what I said earlier in that this is a collaboration, right? You are bringing your sexual self into this space. They're bringing their sexual self into that space. And they're saying, this is successful. Right? And you can say, this is successful, and say, okay, I'll collaborate with you on certain pieces of the parts that work well, right? That we can kind of develop and talk. Okay, what is it about the blowjob that you like? How do you feel? How do you feel with that blowjob? Do you feel powerful? Oh, so you like the feeling of feeling power. Oh, you know what? When I do this, that makes me feel powerful. Do you want to try that and see if you also get the same power feeling that I get? You see how we flip that? So then it's not like, oh my God, my partner's a brute. No. That's not what's happening. Like woo. It's just we just need to tease it out a little bit.
back up a bit here.
Right? Like it's okay, right? Like it's not, it's just that your partner may or may not have the words, they may not have been thinking about it this way, and they may say it in a way that might hit you in a way that you don't want it to hit.
Yeah.
But it's definitely something where you can say, oh, wow, okay, interesting. And is it like, do you feel more powerful with the blowjob laying down or standing up? Like those having even conversations about positioning, right? Like, let's explore this because I feel more physically comfortable, doing that when I'm sitting, right? Or when I'm laying down, right? And I feel better with the 69 position and all of that. And it's like, oh, like you can actually have a conversation about it. And that actually can be quite erotic. You can be like, oh, I didn't know that, babe. It's like, that's really fascinating, and then you can say, and then if you're into sexting, you can kind of say, remember when we were talking about like what you liked about blowjobs the other day? I was just thinking about that after I just sent this work email. See you later. Right?
This is why your Instagram page is just so delightful, because it's full of these cute little, culture flips that you offer to your followers and your fans, because it's just, you have such a wonderful, fun way of bringing this information to people. And unfortunately, we've got to wrap this up here today, but I am so glad we've had this time, and I really look forward to you having your own TV show, and I'd like to be a guest on your TV show when you kind of elbow Dr. Oz out of the way, and it's like this Dr. UC show. That's a show I want to watch. So
I think I would be taken off the air.
No. I think the world is ready for you to have the Dr. UC show. I'm certainly ready for it. I have just thoroughly enjoyed chatting with you today, and I look forward to more opportunities to chat with you in the future, collaborations, anything that we end up in the same orbit, we don't live in the same parts of the country, but I'm sure as this COVID ends up, hopefully we're on the final leg of it now, there will be opportunities to be in the same room at the same time. And I really look forward to orbiting around you again in the future. I am going to put links to all of your stuff in the show notes for people who want to get in touch with you. And do you have any public access programs or anything coming up that are not sort of limited by state and region, that are going to be accessible globally?
Sure. So I have, so first off, Cindy, thank you so much for having me. This has been a pure delight. So I just love chatting with you. We could talk for hours.
Yeah, we really could.
I appreciate it. But yeah, so I have my open platform on my website, uclogic.com, called Woke is the New Sexy, where you could click on different subjects. It could be pelvic pain, it could be pregnancy, postpartum, intersectionality. And there are all these great resources, all of my past posts, all congregated based on subject matter. I also have my book, Sexy Swagger Book, A Guide to Reimagining Your Sex Life. And that's really just a starter kit geared toward women and vulva owners. I'm working on one for men and penis owners later on in the year, where you can just and it's for anyone in their sexual journey, the beginning, and so they can access me that way. And I also do online and group consultation.
Fantastic. What a wonderful gift to the world you are. It's been such a joy. And take care of yourself until next time, UC.
Thank you.
How fantastic is Dr. Ossai? I really enjoyed talking with her, and I really encourage all of you to follow up with her programs and her online stuff and her book, all there on her website. Check it out in the show notes. I think she is an absolute rock star in the sex and education world. Speaking of rock stars, you, my listeners, you're also rock stars. And I am excited once again just to remind you about my book coming out in June of 2022, depending on when you're hearing this. It may have happened. It may be about to happen. It is called Sex When You Don't Feel Like It, The Truth About Mismatched Libido and Rediscovering Desire. Oh my goodness, how many couples struggle with trying to find a match in their desires. And my book coming out in June is available now for pre-order, or maybe for order, again, depending on when you're listening to it. You can get it at any good bookstores, or you can head to my website, cindydarnell.com, follow the tab to books, and you'll see it there. While you're there, check out my online programs in the Online Pleasure School. Something there for everybody. Why not follow The Erotic Philosopher on social media? We are at The Erotic Philos, that's PHILOS, on Instagram and Twitter. You can also follow me, Cindy Darnell, that's CYNDI_DARNELL L on all social media platforms too. One of the ways that we get to keep going and keep this ad-free and commercial-free is because of your ratings and reviews. I'd love it if, while you're hanging out on my website, you selected the podcast tab where you can catch up on all the previous episodes of The Erotic Philosopher, and you'll also find a link to leave a rating and review for us on iTunes. These really matter. I can't stress to you how much of a difference it makes. Your ratings and reviews boost our visibility and make us more accessible and findable to people who need this information, just like you. I absolutely love having you guys here, and I look forward to bringing you the next episode. Until then, take care, and thanks for listening.